a conversation about the Internet of Things, patent licensing for the Internet of Things. And this is a topic that has kind of been, to a large extent, I think, under the current throughout the entire conference. And maybe not so much specifically the Internet of Things, but under the waves, below the radar, are what do you do with a whole bunch of people who are selling products at a very low rate, but maybe want it to include Wi-Fi or need it to have telecommunications, and how do you get those folks licenses while at the same time then not necessarily allowing them to license it for the like Roderick was using the smart flower pot, and this morning I was talking about a connected coffee cup, and take the rights that they've gotten for there and then kick them all the way up, and then eventually those rights somehow transfer into a $100,000 automobile. And that, I think, is a big issue and one that we haven't really addressed, and hopefully we'll talk about that among other things here during this panel today. So let me introduce the panelists. And first we'll start with Julie Carlson, and she is the Director of Economic Strategy at Qualcomm, and her work focuses on analyzing policy issues related to intellectual property, standardization, and innovation. Thanks for being here, Julie.
Glad to be here.
Then next we have Paul Ragusa, and Paul is the practice group co-chair for the IP Transactions Department at Baker & Botts, and he practices in the Baker Botts New York City office, and his practice encompasses high technology and Hatch-Waxman litigation, IPRs, IP portfolio management, licensing, and all of that, including standard essential patents specifically. So thank you for being here, Paul.
Thank you for having me.
And I found Paul because you wrote specifically about this topic with the Internet of Things a few years ago, so thanks for coming and joining the conversation. Then next we have Eric Stasek, and Eric is the founder and managing director of Avika. Did I say that right? Yeah. Avika is a consulting firm located in Stockholm, Sweden, and they specialize in licensing standard essential patents and other patents for the telecommunication industry. He's an electrical engineer by training, so a man after my own heart. Thank you for being here, Eric. Us EEs need to stick together.
Yeah.
And another EE who is unfortunately not able to join us here today, Matteo has been in a number of our programs, Matteo Sabatini, and glad to bring him in via Zoom. And he is a thought leader in the IP space. Probably everybody knows Matteo. He has now recently become president and chief licensing officer of Convita. And he's coming to us from his new home base in Italy. Matteo, glad to have you join us. Thank you for being here today.
Pleasure to be here, at least virtually. And to be more specific, I'm actually in Brussels right now. I'm not in Italy.
So yeah, the world traveler, Great. Well, I appreciate it. So Les and I, we can go in the order in which I introduced you to get preliminary thoughts out about this topic. There's so many things we could talk about dealing with IoT, SEP, licensing. So I won't lead you anyway. I'll let you just take the topic. When you hear that topic, Julie, what's the first thing that you'd like to share?
Yeah, thanks, Gene. I think the first thing to recognize about IoT licensing, which is true of any sort of industry vertical licensing, is that licensing is not costless, right? And so companies like Qualcomm, like others, are going to license in sort of the most efficient way possible, right? So in IoT, what you have is a large number of small firms selling sometimes a large variety of products. We've already, in the last day and a half, talked about flower pots and coffee cup warmers. In my former life at the Federal Trade Commission, smart toasters were the thing that we were talking about sometimes, right, as an example use case. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense for companies, licensors, to really pursue licensing oftentimes at that sort of end use level in IoT, right? It's just too costly. The volumes aren't great enough. And so Some companies don't license IoT at all, and that's a choice that they've made. Other companies, like Qualcomm, has an IoT licensing program, but it's not at the end device level, it's at the module level. And there, we have found that licensing is more efficient because there are a small number of players who cover almost the entire IoT space, right? Now, there's some trade-offs there, right? Because we don't have visibility into the end uses for some of these modules, right? We're not going to be able to capture the entire value of our technology in every end use, but we get greater market coverage by licensing at that module level, since there's those small number of module makers are supplying, nearly the entire space, and that's a trade-off that has made sense for us. Now, as particular end uses develop, right, and the players there are maybe a smaller number of manufacturers, the use becomes more widely adopted, then end device level might make more sense. And you've seen this transformation in auto, right? So initially, when there were very few connected vehicles, Qualcomm, for example, was licensing and still licenses at the module or the TCU level. But now that industry vertical has expanded, more cars are connected, right? Now you're seeing this end-level licensing in auto. And you're starting to see some of that, for example, like in smart meters as well, where there's this easily identifiable growing end use, right? And so I would, and I guess maybe just one other thing to add is there's lots of concerns in this space about, SMEs being chased down for a license. And for the same reasons, it just doesn't make economic sense. Bilateral licensing for SMEs in IoT is just not going to be cost effective. Haven't seen it happening in 4G IoT because it doesn't make economic sense, and so there's not a lot of reason to expect that as sort of 5G expands into Internet of Things that you're going to see, a lot of bilateral licensing of SMEs in that space either.
Yeah. Okay, great. That's a good preview. Paul, your initial thoughts on IoT licensing, or the problems or the solutions, wherever you want to go.
Yeah, so I'll talk about two competing issues where there's an inherent tension. On the one hand, licensing in this space is patent licensing. It's got to be, as we know from Georgia Pacific, a willing licensor, a willing licensee, coming up with a reasonable rate that they can agree on. And in that respect, it's not that much different than licensing any other patent right. Patent owners want to get a ROI on their innovation, and they're entitled to do so. And implementers want to get a rate that they can actually pay. The tension is that we're not talking about a homogeneous group of users. It's a wide variety of users, from automakers selling a $100,000 automobile down to blenders and toasters, right? It's a big chunk. And there are, the supply chain issues, as we see from, Continental litigation and Avanci, are complicated. Where do you license? How do you license? All issues that need to pan out to, I think, as Julie succinctly put it, make sure that patent owners are getting an ROI, but making sure that there's broad market appeal.
Yeah. Okay, great. And Eric, your preliminary thoughts.
Yeah, first, I don't really like Internet of Things as a term, because
it feels more made up in marketing.
It
right?
feels more made up in marketing, because I think that all of these connected things don't involve the internet. You have a term I would use would be network of things, but not is not a good acronym, I think. So IoT is much easier. So I'm going to stay with IoT, but with the idea that not everything involves connectivity through the internet. I agree with what a lot of what Julie said. There's sort of, I look at it as, you can look at this in a really complicated way, but in its most simplified manner. There's high value added products and there's low value added products. And where you have low value added products, connectivity is a commodity, and it should be priced as a commodity, and it should be licensed to chipset manufacturers, module manufacturers. The fewest number to get the largest number of products. I think that's just a practical reality. And then when you have high-value products, remote mining equipment, remote surgical theaters, things like this, there's a completely different pricing structure is going to be needed, and the market, the licensees are different. So I see it really as a two-tiered landscape, and where you go from one tier to the next tier, I have no idea, but I know that there's two tiers.
At least
Two tiers, but I think it gets too complicated if you try to say make it multi-tiered. If you look at, for example, LTE standards, LTE standards, they have narrowband IoT, you have LTE-M, you have LTE Cat 1, all the way up to LTE Cat 20. So, I mean, you could make this really complicated table of this amount of connectivity and the uplink and the downlink, and then have a pricing structure for that. But that seems to me just to be too complicated.
Let's come back to that. Let's bring Matteo in, because I want to come back to that, because I mentioned earlier in the program that I was involved in the independent record label in the music business for a while, and I do think ASCAP and BMI have got some very useful ways of operating, and we'll come back to that. But Matteo, I'd like to hear your preliminary thoughts on this matter. I know you're not specifically dealing with SEPs anymore, but this is an important issue for you still, correct?
Yeah, it is correct, because I represent a company that has done, pardon Eric for the use of the word, research in IoT for more than a decade, right? And so, my initial thoughts, the IoT is not new. The IoT has been out there for a long time, right? Now, I think we see a lot of the value being unlocked because all these connected devices can actually be accessed through services. And I think the main value often is the fact that you can control all these devices through the web, through web services. I can control my connected home through Alexa. I can set the temperature of my kids' room remotely, and so on and so forth. So I think that the first point is to recognize that oftentimes the value to the user is really moving into the services space. And that is true for users like us, like consumers, but it's true also for entire industries. If you look at automotive, the value that the OEMs get by connecting the cars and having feedback in real time in how the cars are used, in how maintenance is needed, and how parts deteriorate faster in certain areas, et cetera. That's a huge value, because it can reduce, for example, the number of times that you need to recall cars, or the number of times that the driver needs to go back to the shop. The second point, which is related to a lot of the things that have been already said, in order to really unlock the value of IoT, price differentiation is going to be absolutely crucial. And price differentiation has been proven in many industries to really unlock value of different verticals. Everybody has highlighted how different verticals have wildly different characteristics and use the technology very differently. LT Cat M or NB IoT that Eric mentioned is one example, right? Is a subset of LTE that can be used for very cheap connected devices. And price differentiation is really the only way that we can really unlock the value of different verticals, right? If we set the same price across different verticals, we can run into the risk that we're pricing it too high in a vertical and therefore hindering adoption. Or we could price it too low in a different vertical where there is a lot more value added, and therefore we're not encouraging innovation in that specific vertical. The last thing I'll say is, the company that I represent is an SME by European standard, a small and medium enterprise. And I think oftentimes we forget that there are SMEs on both sides of the equation, right? There are SMEs that do implement connectivity and connected devices and play in the IoT space, and there are SMEs who actually do research in that space as well, and there are SMEs that do both. And so I think it's important to recognize it, because sometimes that point is missed in policy debates and at regulators level.
Okay, yeah, and so I don't know that I have any specific thoughts on my own at this point, but I am interested to go back to Eric, what you said, and I'd like to get all your comments on this, because when we were just talking over breakfast before we got here, we were talking about how it seems to me that the patent owners the concern that they have is if I lower too low down the food chain, if I license rather too low in the food chain, then when those people get those rights, they often kick them up to the next level, and then they get kicked up to the next level, and they get kicked up to the next level. So you wind up ostensibly powering a connected coffee cup, and then that chip may wind up in something much more expensive later on of an entirely different value. And there's a lot of these things. And I'm thinking about the automotive industry in particular, because the automotive industry has always wanted the suppliers and second, third tier suppliers to get the licenses, kick up the licenses to them. They don't have to deal with the licensing; everything's already paid for, etc. But in this space, when you license lower in the food chain, there's a presumption that then it's going to cost less, and then the rights still get kicked up to like the automobile companies who are selling a $100,000 car. And somewhere in there, it doesn't work out very well for the innovators who are not realizing the value of the connectivity and because all these car companies are selling essentially a computer on wheels anymore, right? And it's a differentiation tool. I mean, if you watch like in the U.S. Chevy commercials, I don't know that a Chevy truck does anything useful anymore other than connect, mobile office, Wi-Fi, all this other stuff. That's all they ever sell it on their ads. So these things obviously matter. People need to get paid for it. And I know, like with ASCAP and BMI, they have a very complicated formula that looks at essentially how much has this song been played over the course of the year, where has it been played, and it's not perfect. They do like a sample. They say they sample about 10% of the market, which is hard to believe. But that they go to venues, they go to bars, they go to big venues, concerts, halls. They listen to the radio, and then there's this formula as to who gets paid what, based on how often these things get played. It seems to me that the SEP area, if we're going to try and license folks in the IoT, there has to be something like that to preserve the right for the patent owners to still get value up the food chain as the value to the consumer gets greater and greater and greater with every step, almost like a value-added tax. So I'll start with you because we just had this conversation moments ago, and I had to excuse myself to come in here and get ready. So I didn't hear your answer. I'd love to hear your answer and talk it out with us now.
Well, there's a couple of different ways that could work. I like what Nokia and Nordic Semiconductor have come to an agreement on. Nordic, I don't know the details of it. I just know the high-level details of it. That Nokia's worked together with Nordic Semiconductor, one of the biggest manufacturers of Bluetooth chips and narrowband IoT chips, to make Nokia licenses available to their customers. And basically, they're following the Qualcomm model: no license, no chips. So that prior to provisioning one of Nordic Semiconductor's customers with chips, Nordic puts them in touch with Nokia. Nokia then, and that potential customer, negotiate a license between the two of them, and then Nordic Semiconductor can provide them chips directly. And I think that's one way to sort of handle it on a bespoke basis. That may be the way things go forward across the board. It's certainly been a successful licensing model for Qualcomm, and it may be something like that.
So can you tell us a little bit about Qualcomm? I guess all your cases are now safely over, and you can talk about it, right?
And this is not a secret. Everybody knew this. So.
Right.
Yeah, I'm in a little bit of an awkward position because I also worked at the FTC while that litigation was ongoing. So
well, please don't recuse yourself.
I'm gonna maybe focus on a different part of your question,
okay,
which is I think what I was kind of hearing in your question is the sort of focus on somehow we have to tailor the pricing to the value at that particular level of sort of the vertical chain.
Well, that certainly is the argument that's made by the implementers, right?
And I think that that's a little bit wrong-headed, right? So I think what we ought to be focusing on, and I think what Qualcomm focuses on, is what is the value that this technology brings to the final product. And that is the benchmark for the royalty charge, right? Now, where that is collected from, we're a little bit indifferent to, right? So if you look at auto licensing, Qualcomm has a long-standing auto licensing program, separate and apart from what's happening with Avanci, right? It's public, it's on our website, it's $5 a connected vehicle unit, right? That can be paid by the module maker, that can be paid by the TCU maker, that can be paid by the automaker, right? So it's disconnecting the total value that the technology brings to the end product from the licensing level, and I think that's maybe we should be thinking about, and even if you want to think about this in the smartphone space, right? I mean, historically, smartphone royalties, right, in the smartphone space have been collected at the device level, right? But the value that the technology brings is greater than just the value of the device, right? If you think about the entire app ecosystem that's built on top of those devices, you think about, you know, Google's advertising ecosystem, for example, that's also built in part on top of that cellular technology. So the entire value is much greater. But because we're in a situation where we've tethered the collection of royalties to the devices, right, often in a ad valorem way as opposed to sort of a per unit collection, we've artificially compressed in some ways the amount that patent holders are able to collect in that space. And so I think there's some argument to be made here to not fixate so much on the value at each level, but what's the total value that the technology brings to the final good.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure I
Yeah.
understand the distinction, I suppose, and maybe it's because we're just in agreement, and I think.
Okay.
And but let me come back to. Let me bring
Yeah.
Paul in here. Paul, I know you litigate these things, you license these things, and where, if you could put your finger on it, where do things break down when it winds up moving from the boardroom into the courtroom? In the IoT space, because there has been some litigation in this space, right?
Yeah, that there has. And look, you know, I think, you know, looking at lessons learned, you know, some of this is not new. Looking at the value proposition from the product side, what is the ultimate end product that this applies to? You know, going back to MPEG-2, AVC patent pools dealing with audio video. There was a carve-out in the original MPEG-2 patent pool for chipsets on this very basis. It didn't feel right to charge $4 on a chipset. It felt great to charge $4 on an HDTV, right?
Right.
And so that decision, and those royalties changed over time, of course. But the decision to look at the end use and to try to adjust the royalty to reflect the value of that end use, you know, is not new, and certainly that has poured over to litigation for ATSC for a number of different cellular technologies. Again, what is the end product? Let's not do a bottom-up approach where we apply it to the smallest saleable unit. Let's look at the actual product. That debate unfortunately continues and will continue.
Yeah, and that's really what this is about. Is that the people, and it's not shocking at all. It shouldn't shock anybody that the people who are paying want to pay as little as possible, and the people who are collecting want to collect as much as possible. And the way that this has worked out, I think, and Matteo, I'd like to get your take on this, is that the people who are licensing want to license at the smallest saleable unit, like Paul was just talking about, so that they can pay less. And the people who are licensing want to collect royalties based on the ultimate end product, so that they can charge more. And in this world where you have billions of connected devices and things of a variety of different values, it makes it a very difficult proposition to work out, it seems.
So I don't think licensors want to charge more. licensors want to charge what is fair based on the value that is created and is added to the product. I completely agree with what Julie was saying. One thing is the value, and I think it's pretty well settled now that the value needs to be calculated where the device is actually used, right? You can't figure out the value of the technology before it gets into the hand of a user, being a consumer or being an industrial player, whatever it is. The difference from the value is the attachment point, right? And so if you go upstream, then sometimes upstream in the supply chain, there are no margins to pay for those licenses based on the value that the technology is bringing to the product. And so you run into this issue where the OEMs push it upstream to their suppliers, and their suppliers are saying, well, I can't just afford to pay that license, because if I do, basically go out of business. So how do we solve it? And I think that Avanci is one way to solve it, right? Offer a simple solution, industry-led, that OEMs find effective and efficient, and the industry find efficient. I think we need to focus on efficiencies, really, in terms of where we go and license. I do hear that sometimes it might make sense to go upstream. I do still feel that there are a lot of issues to be solved, and the Nokia's and Nordic or the Qualcomm agreements might have solved that. But one of the main issues is once you start going upstream, it's very, very difficult to track where the models and the chipset end up going. And so it's very, very difficult to track the actual use. And since we want to make sure that each use has, we recognize the value of the technology, and there might be price differentiation, then how do you do that price differentiation? It becomes quite complex, also from a monitoring and auditing point of view. One thing that I don't think we discuss very often is the fact that, again, in light of efficiency, in different verticals, we might figure out ways to be more efficient by going upstream. And in other verticals, we might even start looking at going downstream, right, at the service layer, the service level. What Julie was saying, that the vast value that is created on top of these technologies. That's also something that we need to start thinking about. The last point that I was going to make was going to go back to what you said, Gene, about clearinghouses. The only thing that I warn is the fact that there is actually rampant piracy in the music industry, in the movie industry, despite this clearinghouse, and despite the fact that honestly these clearinghouses have pretty strong enforcement mechanism, right, that they can activate pretty quickly. In our world, on the other hand, we have a much more difficult proposition, especially with injunctions being virtually not available. And so that I think that needs to be factored into the thinking of how we solve this.
Yeah, no, that's actually an excellent point that I probably hadn't really considered enough. And I certainly don't want anybody to think that what I was suggesting is by saying the patent owners want more, that they're asking for more than what is justified. It's just more than what others are wanting to pay. And so this problem to me, it's human. Those people who are paying don't want to pay as much, and those people who are selling want the person who's paying to pay more. And that more doesn't necessarily mean that it's not valuable. They're asking for some kind of super competitive price or something like that. I don't think that's what's going on. What I think is going on is just simply the patent owners want to get paid for the value that their innovation adds to whatever winds up being sold, whatever service or whatever product winds up being sold, and then the people who are paying, like anybody else, whether it's paying your taxes or whether it's or trying to find ways to slice what they have to pay off and make it lower. And one way that has been somewhat effective, and the arguments have, I think, resonated, is by this smallest saleable unit thing. And then now that kind of seems to have been maybe put to bed, it kind of has morphed into, well, I want to get the rights for myself. You have to deal with me. It's Fran. I'm demanding a license from you. And that's fine if that license stays with that person. but that license doesn't ever really seem to stay with that person. It does seem to be kicked upstream to the next person who's adding greater value and greater value and greater value. And I mean, what I've said, and maybe you guys can talk about this and kick it around, and is if I were a patent owner, I have no problem licensing anybody on any level that what they wanted, right? But if I have, if what you're doing is trying to collect rights at a low level in the auto industry, so you can kick it all the way up to the manufacturers who are going to, car companies who are going to sell $100,000 automobiles plus or minus, well then you, no matter how expensive or cheap what you are actually doing or selling is, has to justify me not being able to license BMW, Volvo, all those other companies. So, and what you'll do is you'll be paying so much more than you need to be paying. And if they're okay with that, in order to keep the car companies happy, I couldn't care less. But we can't have innovators not getting fair value for where it's ultimately adding value to somebody else's product.
But it's really complicated, Gene. You look at the example you just gave. If I take Avansi's $32 for a 5G connected vehicle, and I put that at the chipset level, and if not all the chipset manufacturers want to follow that model, I mean, $32 at the chipset level is going to really distort the market for chipsets.
Right.
So there's a real risk that you're going to have, ND problems in your licensing model if it's not accepted by everybody.
See, I don't see how okay, so this is another thing that we talked about during breakfast. The ND, discrimination, if discrimination means anything, it has to mean that I'm treating similarly situated people similarly, right? So now if all of you in one level, one layer are trying to correct the rights, not for yourself, not because you're afraid that me, patent owner, is going to come after you and sue you, but because your customers are afraid that when they take what you did and they layer on extra value and now it's really much more valuable, that the patent owner is going to go after them. Well, that to me is a whole different structure. And if you're not willing to pay the patent owner for the ability to indemnify or kick the license up, well then you're just an infringer.
Well, so Gene, I feel like you're making the argument for not licensing at the chip level and for end device licensing, right? Because the further upstream you go in the vertical chain, the less confidence you have in where that intermediate product is going to end up in order to not be licensing in a discriminatory fashion.
Right. So and so what I'm trying to do is trying to point out the problems here with the arguments that are made by the implementers who are trying to say, oh, you have to license me, you have to give me FRAND, and then they don't want it for themselves, they want it for some other third-party beneficiary. Okay, well, that can't work. That system can't work.
Well, I agree with that, but I think...
And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, what can we do? Because I also am sympathetic, right, to, like Roderick was talking about, the smart flower pot, right? The person who is not going to be kicking it up to anybody, right? They're selling on eBay. They're selling on Amazon. They're selling on Facebook.
Nobody's asking them for a license.
Right, and maybe that's just simply the answer, right? That may be simply the answer, because that's one of the things that, and I know in Europe it's come up, that people are saying, well, maybe some of these uses are so small that they shouldn't have to get a license. And I hate when it's worded that way.
If they buy a Qualcomm chip, they have to get a license.
Right. Well,
I'm just saying.
But as I explained, right, it doesn't make economic sense. It's not efficient for Qualcomm to chase down every IoT device maker. There's too many, they're too small, the volumes are too low, the value is not there. That's why we have chosen to have an IoT licensing program that's at the module level, where even at the module level, depending on what the capabilities of the module are, you can kind of have some sense about the value of the end use. And so there might be, as Matteo talked about, some differentiation in licensing rates at the module level. But there, we're covering the majority of the IoT space through a small number of module makers, not incurring the cost of chasing down these SMEs or flower pot makers or whoever it is.
Right. No, I get that. Let's bring Paul in, because is that, would that be FRAND? Do you think that that would be FRAND? Because let's say, for example, not to say, I'll just give an example, and not to say this is Qualcomm or anybody in particular, but let's just say that I, patent owner Gene Quinn, decided that I'm not going to try and license the flower pot makers, the toaster makers, the smart coffee cup makers, whatever. And because I don't really care, they're going to do what they're going to do. My fear is, as I've said, is I don't want to give a cheap license to somebody who is demanding FRAND simply so that they can pass it on and up to somebody else. Okay, so if I then said that I'm not going to license any of you, but I'm also not going to go after you, does that satisfy FRAND, or do you think that the FRAND, because what I hear from the implementers is FRAND requires them to license me if I want a license, and then whatever I do with the rights I get, I do with the rights I get, and that these things are incongruous to me. So what say you, Paul?
Yeah, look, I think a patent owner always has the right to use or enforce its IP as it chooses. I mean, there are some restrictions on that, notably estoppel. But the idea that you have to be able to go to a patent owner and get a FRAND rate to get a license, as opposed to having them say, we're just not going to license you, that to me doesn't fall into the bucket of non-discriminatory. It would fall into the bucket of non-discriminatory if a company chose to license some manufacturers in that space and chose not to license others, and they go after them in court. That would be bad, right? Mm-hmm. But that hypothetical, I think you could handle that way.
Yeah, and to be clear, if the smart flower pot manufacturer came to Qualcomm and said, we'd like to take a license, we're not going to turn them away. We might first query whether they need a license and are they already buying modules from somebody who's already licensed. But if that turns out not to be the case and they want to take a license, we're happy to enter into that conversation.
Yeah.
But if they make handsets, the answer is no, right? The module maker or the component maker isn't going to get a license, and you're going
in handsets.
In
That's
handsets,
right. Because but in handsets, right? There are really only 5 handset makers of any significant size, and it's the same thing that I talked about in our IoT licensing, right? We don't license end device in IoT because too many players, too small. But in handsets, right, you can identify the 5 players, and it's efficient to license at that level.
Or is it that you're offering end user device licenses to a component manufacturer? I mean, you're exhausting your patents at the level of the component, irrespective of how that component is used.
In the IoT space.
In IoT space,
yes.
right? Okay.
Right.
So, and that's the word that gets kicked around, right? Is exhaustion. Right,
that's the
although
the
I
point.
should say not a lawyer, so that is my understanding.
Right, yeah.
That's why I say it's an end user device license, but it's granted to a component manufacturer so that their customer gets the benefit of that license.
Yeah, no, and I think that's perfectly legitimate, but I think it also has to be a part of the deal and negotiated. And you can't present that, I want a license. I'm entitled to a license. You're discriminating against me because I have good money here and I'm willing to pay for the license. When in fact they're never going to go after you, and you don't intend to be the beneficiary of your own license. You intend to give it to somebody else, and whether it be explicitly give it to them, or you indemnify them, right? And both are problematic. Paul, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, there's a fine line there between patent exhaustion and having an enforceable field of use restriction, right? So, you
Right.
want to be able to grant the flower pot manufacturer the right to do IoT for flower pots, but not then to take that cheap license and turn it into a vehicle. I mean, that's it's a fine line there.
Right. So where are the courts, in your estimation, and this maybe matters geographically around the world, where are they coming down on exhaustion versus legitimate restrictions on use?
Yeah, so I mean, we have Quanta here in the United States, and that there are enforceable field of use restrictions. If it's spelled out, it's got to be non-conditional. It's got to be clear. My understanding, and I think folks that practice more in Europe can talk a little bit more about it, is it's tougher. It's a tougher road to plow in Europe. You're going to be faced with exhaustion.
Yeah. Eric, do you have any
Gene,
thoughts? Oh, go ahead, Matteo.
No, sorry, I was gonna, I don't mean to sort of backtrack, but I wanted to go back to something that Paul discussed as well as Julie, in terms of non-discrimination and efficiency, right? I mean, effectively, it's not efficient to go after every small device manufacturer that has numbers that are so limited that just makes it for transactional costs that are not worth it, right? A thought that I have to address the non-discrimination or potential non-discrimination part is that de facto one could think about ways to give fully paid up licenses up to a certain number of devices, and that is offered to everybody, right? And so every manufacturer that falls below that threshold, that threshold needs to be thought through, right, is basically taking a license without any financial obligation. And if they cross that threshold, then they start paying, and that paid up license up to N devices a year can be extended to all licensees, right? And so the small manufacturers will be basically virtually already licensed and don't have to pay. And if they grow, then they'll start paying what everybody else pays.
Yeah. What do you guys think about something like that?
Well, I think one of the big issues in IoT, to go back to that term, is indemnification. Now, just because the small manufacturers didn't get a licensing offer doesn't mean that they're licensed. And if they've identified their downstream customers, as they normally do, even if the patent holder doesn't go after them, and they're not licensed. So there's this issue of indemnification. So I think that's the big issue for me for IoT, is that the end user device manufacturers and the providers of connectivity, this needs to be clear and worked out between them what the responsibilities are and who's going to pay for what. I mean, that was the problem with Continental Nokia. I think it was more of a supplier indemnification issue rather than where the license was going to be granted. It was who was going to pay for it. And I agree that there's a lot of forbearance that goes on in the industry, that you don't go after a small customer or a small infringer because there's no money in it. It costs you more money in trying to license them than you get out of them. There's a lot of that goes on, and that's fine, but so long as they don't understand that they're licensed by that kind of behavior and that they've worked it out in their supplier agreements that they're not on the hook for their customers' infringement. If it goes into a high-value product and suddenly one of the SEP holders decides that high-value product manufacturer is an attractive target.
Yeah. So okay, I see. I think I understand what goes on in these situations. So the company A, smaller companies, supplies mid-level manufacturers who are then going to make something and kick it up the chain to somebody who's going to put it in an automobile, and it's going to be worth a different amount of money, right? So those mid-level people are going to the smaller component manufacturers and saying, I want you to get the rights, or I want you to indemnify me. And so then the small players come and say, well, I can't sell unless I can get the rights or I can indemnify them. And it's like, okay, well, that's fine, but then the price you, small fry, have to pay is not your price, it's their price. Right. And that's where it falls about, what do you mean I have to pay their price? I'm only selling this for, $15 a unit or $10 a unit, and you're asking me to pay $20? Well, yeah, because you're kicking it up to somebody, and at that level, it would be worth $20. And you want to cover them, but you want to pay a $2 or $1 or 50-cent license to me. And that math just, when you lose money on every sale, it doesn't, the curve never bends. You still just lost money on every sale.
That's not a sustainable business.
It's an unsustainable business model, particularly when you're investing literally billions and billions and billions of dollars in research and development every year, and so it strikes me that I get the business rationale and the business need that these smaller entities have to take into account, but it feels to me like they really want their cake and eat it too, because they want to pay a little on their end and they want to be able to indemnify the people that they're selling to because they can't sell otherwise. So that's my business reality. So you patent owners just have to eat it. And that is a recipe for patent owners not being patent owners very long, them going out of business and doing no R&D ever again. Paul, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, look, I mean, just a thought that kind of ties together Matteo's last comment and your comments, particularly going back to ASCAP and the record industry. That there is precedent with patent pools doing the same thing. I mean, Blu-ray being an example. The standard is the compression standard, not the actual discs that people buy in the store. Mm-hmm. But how do you make that into a reasonable royalty formulation? I mean, it's by the number of discs that are printed, right? So, that there would be tiers depending upon the volume of use, and I think that's something that could be useful in this context, as Matteo has suggested.
Yeah. So one of the things that we had, let me look at the time. Okay, we're doing okay on time. We blew right past the first question that I had listed for the panel, and Julie, I think you mentioned it a little bit or alluded to it a little bit with the value proposition. Is what is the value of standardization for IoT? I mean, and it's enormous. I mean, in my mind, the sum of the parts may be the sum of the parts may be greater than each of the individual parts on their own, because, and I think you mentioned this with the phone. There's the phone, and the phone is worth X. Okay, now the fact that now that phone can be used anywhere in the world on anybody's networks, communicate from iPhone to Android, OS to Android. There's an awful lot of additional value that goes above and beyond just what the component pieces put together in this computer in our pocket are. And it strikes me that really defines IoT, right? And on some levels, it maybe isn't as great, right? It's nice that your alarm clock can talk to your coffee pot without you knowing in the morning and start the coffee, and maybe it checks in with the refrigerator, midday or something like that. That's all nice. It's all fun. It's cool. It's useful. It's not. I don't want to belittle it because it is a utility, right? It makes life more convenient. Different level of utility than an iPhone being able to talk to an Android, either here in the U.S. or when you're halfway around the world in Australia. That's a different level of value. And that, I think, defines the struggle of IoT, does it not?
What?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say, and Matteo's comment, that it's not devices talking to each other, but devices talking to a service layer. Mm. And that service layer is what's providing the value. So it's a really complicated picture.
Yeah.
And I also think a lot of this conversation, even as we've been talking about it here today, is focused on consumer IoT, but there are a lot of sort of non-consumer industrial IoT. I don't particularly like to use industrial IoT because it's more than that, but more what I think of like B2B IoT applications, right? Mm-hmm. So you have things like in grocery stores, right, where you have sort of these smart shelf labels, right, and you can sort of track where a consumer is in the store, and maybe what's on this consumer shopping list, and when they show up at that particular aisle, right, you display some sale or deal to that consumer.
Change the price every hour.
Well, or change the price, right? Or like with asset tracking, like
see, I don't like that changing price thing.
Could go down.
Right, I mean, right. So this
won't though. I mean, like, because I know, like, where we live, to get anybody to come out to our house to do anything, like they'll give you a quote and say, "Oh, wait a minute, where do you live?" And then you give them your zip code. Oh, I'm sorry, and the price they come back with is always higher.
Yeah. But I mean, there's also like asset tracking, for example, right? So if you want to like be tracking like where perishable goods are, or are they still being stored at the right temperature, and right, those are things that are like very valuable to businesses that provide a lot more value than our sort of
right
one-off examples we've been giving here about coffee pots and
we kind of and I've been probing the extremes on each side, right? Because I don't think if we can't figure out the extremes, which should be the layups, then how in the hell are we going to figure out the stuff in the middle?
Right.
Where you really do or really should have some kind of three-dimensional calculus, multivariable equation to kind of come out to the proper balance for people to pay and for people like Qualcomm to receive. And and it seems to me that we, particularly and increasingly, and maybe this is the problem, the people in the IoT on the low end, on the flower pot end, the coffee end, on the connected toaster end, these are not people who are used to paying for patent licenses. You know, this is probably the first time that any of them have ever had to deal with something like that. What do you mean I have to pay for a patent license? I'm not using this person's patent.
That's a little bit overblown in my experience, that argument, because they're buying screws, they're buying plastics, they're buying all kinds of things on their bill of material. And a patent license is just another thing on the bill of material.
No, I get that, but you know, the same way that we were just talking, and it's not applicable to this conversation, but over breakfast we were talking about value-added tax, right? And it's kind of hidden, right? So people don't know exactly how much they're paying. It's easy to raise an awful lot of money with value-added tax. Yes, you go and you buy these nuts and you buy these bolts and you buy this or whatever, and implicit in a lot of these things, they have been buying patent licenses for products that then they include in their other products that they sell. It's just not explicit. So now for the first time, somebody, you know, you hire Paul and you say, Paul, I need you to go after this group of people and send them letters and see if they can become licensees, and if not licensees, well then, you know, have at it, you know. And for that group in this lower level IoT, I think that's the first time that somebody like you might have ever contacted them about this, right? Right?
In all likelihood, yes.
Yeah. And how does that go?
Well, you know, look, you use the tools that we have, and the tools that we have are not bad. Going back to Georgia Pacific, I mean, what are the factors that come into the royalties? It's not just the cost of materials. It's convoyed sales. It's how is this actual technology helping you overall? And you know, that's something that you would argue with the person as far as, look, you know, before you started using this chipset, you were selling X, now you're selling Y. There's obviously some difference that's going on here, and you need to help, you know, compensate for that.
Right. I mean, you're doing this for a reason. You added this functionality because you presumably thought consumers would want it, right? Matteo, I see you smiling.
Yeah, no, I was gonna sort of mention an anecdote because it goes back to what we were saying about smaller companies, verticals, etc. So a friend of mine runs an IoT company, and he gave me a call some time ago. We're talking about a few years ago, and he was all screaming and mad because he got approached by a licensor to take a license. And he called me asking me, what shall I do? Why me? What's going on? This is crazy. The usual, you know, shock of someone who's never been approached. And my reaction was, well, first of all, go down to the cellar, pick up a good bottle of wine, open it and drink it, because you got to celebrate, because you made it. I mean, you've been approached because you have a successful business and you're making money. Otherwise, no one will ever contact you if you are failing. So that's just an anecdote, but it's the reality of what's going on in what we were talking about, efficiency. I was going to throw out another sort of thoughts here in what everybody's been saying about the complexity of this industry, right? The different verticals can be wildly different, as we discussed. Take asset tracking, right? If you track trash and trash bins is one thing. If you track nuclear waste, that's a very different use case and a very different use of the network, probably, to make sure that you don't lose that nuclear waste, right? And I think that this complexity, you know, I find it bizarre that regulators around the world are trying to put their finger on the scale and say, I'm a bureaucrat with no negative connotation to that word, right? I'm a bureaucrat. I've never worked in this industry, and yet I want to regulate and determine what's fair and what's the fair pricing for a wildly complex ecosystem. Why not letting the professional do it? Why not letting the industry who's working in these verticals determine what is the most efficient way to deal with it? How can someone in Brussels or in DC be helpful in this discussion? I'm a little puzzled.
Paul, you got a smile on your face.
Yeah, no. Well, I think the regulators are also, you know, not on uniform ground too. I mean, you see here in the United States, NIST is taking the approach. The National Institute for Standards and Technology is taking the approach that you know, we want the industry to self-regulate as the first instance and only step in if there's instances where we see, you know, true issues, racial discrimination. I mean, issues that need government intervention. And then you see in Europe an opposite approach where they want to have somehow magically an evaluation for every standard essential patent on the planet by people that have no competence in doing so. So it's not
What could go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong, right?
Yeah, and it's and I've heard, and some people say that well, you need government, you need regulations, but I think it would be helpful to have, if you're going to do this, not that I think it's the right thing to do, as I've said over the last couple of days, I think it's exactly the wrong thing to do, because I think we wind up getting into a jurisdictional turf war. If Europe does this, then China's going to do something, and the United States is going to do something, and they're all going to look different, even if it's just a sliver of difference, because you can't have a regulator just say, oh, they got it right, and you really don't need me, so we're just going to adopt what they did. That's just not what happens, right? So they're all
well, Thierry Breton is encouraging people to adopt what Europe's doing.
Right.
That was part of his press conference introducing the regulation.
Yeah, we'll see how far that goes.
Well, I think that they underestimate the complexity of this and the difficulty. For example,
Right.
Avanci announced their smart meter licensing program more than a year ago, and through all that time, they didn't announce any licensee or any rate, because they first had to announce the program and then go out and talk to the licensees and the licensors, and this back and forth negotiation to say, okay, what should the price be? Like, what's a price we can all agree upon? That's a really difficult thing to do, and it's not something that can be done in any kind of transparent way, because there's a lot of give and take, a lot of compromise, there's a lot of arm twisting and flattery and whatever it takes to make a deal like that work. And I think that the Commission has really underestimated the complexity of doing something like that, and it takes time. I mean, they're saying that this FRAND determination is going to take 9 months before you can file a lawsuit. They're envisioning that this can take less than a year. And I look at that was an isolated use case that's pretty clear. It shouldn't have been very complicated. And even there, it took almost a year, a little over a year, for them to sign up the first licensee.
Yeah, I think that this is a mistake to think that you could take people who have up till now had really nothing professionally to do with this industry and drop them in, and they're gonna figure it out.
Well, they'll hire a consultant from Charles Rivers Associates probably to do
Right.
this, who has a little bit of background in it, we can imagine.
Right.
But the point is, this is a really complicated thing, and I don't think it can be done with the amount of transparency that the Commission anticipates.
Here's an idea: if you're going to hire people who don't know what they're I shouldn't say that. It's not meant to be. They don't know what they're doing. Not a part of the industry. They're not a part of the industry, so they're not intimately. They're not doing litigation. They're not doing licensing. They're not doing the SSO negotiating. Why don't we just have this like radical idea of letting people who are judges handle it, who are good at judging and good at listening to both sides, and then saying, okay, I think on 1, 2, and 3 you're right, and I think on 4, 5, and 6 you're right, and here's my decision, right? You know what? And if you don't want the judge to do it, because the judge is a decider, and the judge is the decider because you two haven't been able to come to any agreement on your own, right? Why don't we just let somebody who's an expert in deciding stuff handle
that's
this?
ADR, isn't it?
Right. That's what we have already.
Right.
Now, could that be made? I would love to see that judicial process and system made smoother, more uniform, and better for all parties. Creating an entire layer of bureaucracy to accomplish something that really needs tweaking, I think, is a mistake. When I went to law school, I was in New Hampshire, and the New Hampshire Supreme Court decided that it was unconstitutional the way education was being funded, because there was poor communities not being able to spend as much as rich communities, and when you did the math, there was a $13 million deficit that the poorer communities across New Hampshire couldn't be up on this level. So in order to solve a $13 million problem, they created a $1 billion Department of Education infrastructure. You know, and that's just the way government works, right?
Or doesn't work.
Or doesn't work. You know, so I am afraid, and not to say that any of the people over in Europe have ill intention. I don't think they do. But I think the track record of government coming in, particularly when you put people who are not a part of the industry in charge of doing this, it's gonna go poorly. And
And
this
let
is
the
an area
trademark
where
office-
we can't afford that. Matteo, go ahead.
And let the trademark office deal with the standard essential patent. That sounds like a very good idea.
Right, right. So, okay, so we're a little bit over, but I'd like to give each of you in rapid fire an opportunity for your final thoughts, your parting thoughts. What do you hope maybe people remember from this conversation? And we'll start. Matteo, let's just start with you.
Sure. Very quickly, two things that I want to mention. I think one is positive for patent owners. The other one is worrying for the ecosystem in general. And they both tie back to Avanci, if you wish. One thing that Avanci did, which I find quite reasonable, was the fact that the rates eventually went up, in the sense that you can't keep dragging your feet forever. At some point, if you want the FRAND rate, you need to move and you need to negotiate that FRAND rate. And I think it's an important concept to keep in mind, because you can't potentially have the benefit of the FRAND rate if you have no intention of taking a license on those FRAND terms. And there is a recent decision with Orange, and I think was a Cisco subsidiary, against HTC, which confirmed that point, right? That if you are unwilling, ultimately, why would you be entitled to take the FRAND rate that everybody else is paying? I think that's an important point, and we start finally to see that being applied. I think it's a very correct point to make. Yeah. The other point that I was going to make is on the Avanci programs and success thereof. If you look at the 4G success of their program, pretty much all manufacturers out there have been licensed, which confirms that really industry-led solutions are actually working, with one exception, one big exception, China. All the manufacturers from China are the only ones who are not taking licenses through Avanci.
Yeah, and that's a problem we've talked about over the last couple of days. Is you can't take a license if it's gonna make you uncompetitive. And right now the Chinese companies are competing with everybody all around the world. They're not taking licenses. But that's another topic, another panel for another day. Thanks, Matteo. Eric.
My quick summary is supplier indemnification. I think that's key in IoT. If you're an implementer, understand what your supplier is providing with you in terms of indemnification, what they can't provide you, and just kind of get a picture of your risks. Same thing for tier one suppliers. Understand what that supplier contract means in terms of your ability or the responsibilities put on you for indemnification, and just make sure that you understand where the risks are and approximately how big they're going to be.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that hard, actually.
No.
But you need to be aware of it, and I think that's what happened in the automotive industry. It took them by surprise. They had these long-term supplier contracts that were negotiated before Avanci came on the scene, and they were sort of stuck in that old paradigm.
Yeah.
And I think it becomes easier now because everybody's aware of what's happening, and they can work it into their business model and their bill of material.
And the auto industry used to be big enough to force everybody into their paradigm.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and now they're playing in a different pond.
Right.
Yeah.
But now that it's clear, and I think it's out in the open, and everybody's aware of it, their $32 isn't the problem, and now you know who's going to pay, so they can price it into their
Right.
bill of materials.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for being here, Eric. Julie.
Yeah, so I would just maybe emphasize that, as I started with, that licensing is not costless, and to the extent companies are going to license, they're going to do it in those areas where the value is clear. There's a small number of easily identifiable implementers, and in 4G IoT, we did not see licensors sort of chasing down SMEs to take a license, and I don't think we should expect to see that with 5G IoT either.
Great. Thanks, Julie. And Paul, you have the final word.
Yeah, look, the system isn't perfect. That there are some flaws. It's good that various governments are listening and thinking about potential fixes, but the whole system doesn't need to be overhauled. Let's see how things pan out and make adjustments if needed.
Great. Well, thank you very much for everyone. That was a great conversation.